The Azurite Sea Set Championships are fast approaching, and for those wanting to get their hands on the Scar Heartless Hunter Enchanted promo card, or even the Playmat, we've got you covered. In this video, we're going to go over 6 decks that we think will give you a great shot at winning. These will be bite-sized deck profiles, introducing the deck's core strengths and weaknesses. We'll also give a rundown of the strategy and key cards, as well as highlighting some tech cards you can add depending on what you expect at your local set championship. So let's go! We're kicking things off with one of the most consistent decks in Lorcana, Ruby Amethyst. In our opinion, Ruby Amethyst is still one of the most accessible decks to pick up as it has a very linear game plan. Apply early lore pressure, accrue card advantage, remove threats, and then close down the game. It's arguably a very forgiving deck that doesn't punish mistakes as harshly as some other decks can, but it's also a deck that can punish your opponent's mistakes. It's this flexibility that makes it a great pick for set champs. Though it's a deck that doesn't truly have any one-sided matchups. Considering how popular the deck is, you'll probably be playing a lot of mirror matches. But let's take a deeper look at the list. The core of Ruby Amethyst hasn't changed much, focusing on drawing cards and removing threats. In most cases, you want to open with one of your 1-drop cards, both of which provide ways to start building card advantage. Following up with Flynn Rider on turn 2 provides a ton of early game pressure due to his ability Narrow Advantage. To really maximize this, Sisu on turn 3 creates an opener powerful enough to run over many decks, especially when you're on the play. The new Genie Wish Fulfilled is one of the new strongest cards you'll see in this deck, and will also feature in a few of the other decks we're covering today. His ability to draw a card and quest for 2 alone is super powerful, but his evasiveness can make him tricky for many decks to deal with. Once you got Genie on board, you'll want to continue building card advantage with Merlin Rabbit and protecting him as much as possible by bouncing him back to hand with Madam Mim Fox and Snake. And once you're at the 15 to 16 lore mark, Merlin Goat can be deployed to help gain the lore needed to push you over the finish line. Outside of its general plan, Ruby Amethyst of course has plenty of tools to deal with your opponent's board as well. Brawl remains a deceptively simple card. Being able to remove 2 strength characters like opposing genies can really swing the momentum. Elsa the 5th Spirit is another card that has seen success in this list. While she doesn't swing for much herself, being able to exert an opposing character leaves them open to damage. We've also included 2 copies of Belle Accomplished Mystic in our list, as this is a card that's been seeing success at tournaments. She can be used after a challenge to apply even more damage to opposing characters. Lady Tremaine and Madame Medusa remain staples of the list, both great options depending on the situation. Medusa is often best held to remove Amber's Singers or Amethyst Rabbits and Genies, while Tremaine can wipe out bigger threats in Ruby or Sapphire. And Be Prepared is there to reset the board if your opponent goes too wide, but be sure to have answers available to respond to whatever your opponent follows up with. The core of Ruby Amethyst is a well-oiled machine at this point, but there are certainly some good options for tech cards depending on what you expect at your local meta. If you think you'll be seeing a lot of aggressive or Amethyst decks, which means a lot of genies, including a copy or 2 of Sisu Empowered Sibling is a great option. She can even shift on Sisu and Bolden Warrior too. If you're expecting a lot of Sapphire decks, increasing the copies of Lady Tremaine can help deal with big targets like Tamatoa. And of course we have to mention one of my favourite cards in the whole game, the Queen's Castle. If you're expecting to see lots of control decks, this location can help find other ways to generate lore and force a response from your opponent. It's also the perfect follow-up if your opponent plays Be Prepared. Ruby Amethyst's early aggression and ability to close out games with Goat make it particularly strong against decks like Ruby Sapphire. It's also favoured into Amethyst Steel, where Ruby's removal can outvalue Steel's. On the other hand, Ruby Amethyst can struggle against more aggressive decks. Amber Steel can be a real problem as it's able to shut down Flynn with songs, and Pete, Game Referee, can block Be Prepared. Amethyst Emerald is another deck that can cause some problems, and that's going to be the next deck we'll take a look at. With Azurite Sea, Amethyst Emerald has really climbed to be one of the strongest decks in the format. If you're looking for a deck that can comfortably switch roles from questing heavily to controlling your opponent, then Amethyst Emerald may be the one for you. It's also a deck that rewards playing strategically and planning multiple steps ahead to get the most value. With only characters in this deck, it does help reduce some of the decision making and focuses more on questing and challenging. It also has a great matchup into many slower decks, although the deck can struggle against steel decks. Amethyst Emerald plays pretty low to the ground, with a high number of low-cost characters there to apply early lore pressure. Curse Merfolk is still a strong piece of this deck, especially against slower decks. The additional pressure it applies by forcing a discard when banished can often lead less experienced players to keep it around longer than they should. Banzai is another early game threat. With 3 strength, he will often force your opponent to make unfavourable trades, although he is vulnerable to Steel's removal. That of course can be mitigated with Ursula Deceiver, who can strip opponent songs, giving her utility early in a game, but also removing threats like Be Prepared on turn 6. Genie once again is a workhorse in this deck. continuing to apply pressure and accrue card advantage into the mid game. Comboed with Merle and Crab, he can also take out opposing genies. Another good synergy with Merle and Crab is Diablo, who will also allow you to draw a card whilst removing opponent threats. Kick Cloud Kicker is another great way to disrupt your opponent, and another great way to deal with opposing genies. Are you seeing a pattern yet in this meta? At the top end of the curve, we have 2 copies of Ursula's Sea Witch Queen. Ursula is a juggernaut of a card against the right deck, especially against Steel Song, a notoriously difficult matchup for this deck. We also have Clarabelle Light on her hooves, who can provide excellent card draw potential to let you refill your hand and apply even more pressure. Closing out the game will come down to your goats, as well as the White Rose, a new addition for Azurite Sea. But perhaps the biggest upgrade this deck got was with Go-Go to Mago. Go-Go's ability allows for some potentially massive lore gains. If your opponent doesn't play around Go-Go, they'll be punished hard. And even if they do respect Go-Go, it will often force them to make unfavourable trades to prevent leaving damaged characters on board. When it comes to tech cards, there are a few options. Belle Accomplished Mystic can easily swap out Ursula's Sea Witch Queen if you're expecting a lot of aggressive decks in your local meta. She also combos nicely with Go-Go by allowing you to set up damage in advance. Hades Lord of the Dead is another fun card, granting you lore when your characters are banished on your opponent's turn. This can be a great way to force your opponent into some tricky situations. Amethyst Emerald has good matchups into slower decks like Ruby Sapphire and even Ruby Amethyst. It does however struggle into steel decks such as Amber Steel and Amethyst Steel, since they can negate much of the pressure this deck is trying to apply, especially in the early game. We have another Amethyst deck to look at, this time Amethyst Steel. Amethyst Steel is another deck that can switch between aggressive questing and control, which can make it a really good pick for set champs. The playstyle is also quite linear, focusing on removing opponent threats whilst playing out your own. And with the card draw available, it makes this deck very consistent. The uninteractive lore gains through Goat and White Rose again mean you're able to close out games against control decks. However, its late game can be quite weak, and the deck often struggles to recover from board wipes. Amethyst Steel is a deck that can be played with the foot on the gas, creating a wide board of aggressive questers, but it's also comfortable playing more slowly into the mid game. The low cost characters in this list should be pretty familiar now, with the likes of Diablo and Chernobog's followers. Where Amethyst Steel shines though is with its strong 2-drop characters. Smee is a well-known aggressive quester that will often force your opponent into unfavourable trades because of his strength, but he can also be used offensively too, dealing with early aggression from your opponent. Calhoun though is possibly the MVP of this deck, able to deal with threats whilst simultaneously generating lore. Her resist 1 can make her difficult for other steel decks to deal with, so she can often stick around a couple of turns at least. The mid game package looks familiar to both Ruby Amethyst and Amethyst Emerald, relying on Genie to apply pressure, and bouncing Merle and Rabbit to generate card advantage to play out more threats. Steel though also has access to Pete, Games Referee, who can turn off a huge amount of removal, letting you set up game-winning board states your opponent simply can't answer. Bouncing back to hand with Madam Mim to use his effect turn after turn and put your opponent in some tight spots. In terms of removal, Fire the Cannons is great in your opening hand to deal with early game threats, like removing Diablo Devoted Herald. It can also be comboed with Genie or Elsa to, you guessed it, take out opposing genies. Since you'll likely go wide, Strength of a Raging Fire lets you deal massive damage, and we've included 1 copy of Along Came Zeus, though you could add more depending on your comfort level with Uninkables. When it comes to cards to swap in, if you want to go even more aggressive, Maleficent biding her time in the 1-drop slot can give you an explosive early start. Adding in some Lawrence, Jealous Manservant, or Pluto Guard Dog can provide some big damage output, but also synergize well with Belle Accomplished Mystic. Finally, the library is another card I think could be added to this list, especially again if you're expecting a control heavy metagame at your local store. It synergizes super well with your 1-drops, netting you even more card advantage as well as putting on some lore pressure. Because of the removal options available, Amethyst Steel does well against aggressive decks like Amber Amethyst as well as Emerald Steel. It can struggle more against control decks like Ruby Amethyst and Ruby Sapphire, but can be tuned to be more aggressive into those matchups if you're expecting to see a lot of them. Taking a break from Amethyst now, let's take a look at Amber Steel songs. Watchers of this channel will know this is a personal favourite deck of mine. Amber Steel has some of the best removal options available thanks to its singers, being oppressive for most decks to deal with. It can also flex comfortably between being aggressive whilst also controlling your opponent's board. While its high roll potential can lead to some of Lorcana's most one-sided games, this is a deck that can sometimes beat itself if you're not able to find the right cards. Steel Song takes advantage of one of Lorcana's best mechanics, singing. Establishing singers and then using them to take out opponent threats is the core of this deck. Cinderella remains the cornerstone of the early game, Being able to sing 3-cost songs as early as turn 2 shuts down pretty much anything played on the opponent's side of the board. Let the Storm Rage on is perfect against most early game characters whilst also drawing a card, and Strength of a Raging Fire becomes more powerful as you snowball to victory. Ursula on turn 2 opens up the ability to sing 4-cost songs like Along Came Zeus, and then Ariel on 3 allows you to dig for more songs, including the all-important Whole New World. A Whole New World is one of the most important cards of this deck, and being able to sing it on turn 3 or 4 is what the deck most wants to do. Alongside Ariel, Naveen provides another way to sing on turn 4, especially if Ariel's banished, something that will happen quite often. But he can also be used as a comeback mechanic to take out opponent threats where needed. The other potential singer on turn 3 is a shifted Robin Hood. Outside of just singing, Robin is great at dealing with threats on your opponent's side of the board, and his high willpower also makes him the perfect target for Rapunzel. Setting up a Rapunzel heal is a fantastic way to generate card advantage, and it's something many opposing players will fail to play around. The new Pluto Guard Dog is another target for Rapunzel's healing, and a backbreaking card for many decks to deal with. His 5 willpower will often require multiple characters to get through, even once his strength is reduced. Pete is also in this deck as a way to shut down opponent removal, especially after you're able to set up a wide board. One of Steel Song's strong points is the ability to shift focus depending on the matchup, and an early game threat like Dizzy Duck helps generate huge amounts of lore, and is difficult for many decks to remove. Steel Song is one of the most diverse decks and can be built in many ways depending on your playstyle and expected metagame. If you prefer to remove the Robin Hood shift package, Nala, Mischievous Cub is a turn 1 play that is difficult to remove, and another potential Rapunzel target. Adding in Gaston Baritone Bully provides a more consistent Singer 5, and one not as easily removed as Ariel. You could also consider including a couple of copies of Ariel Sonic Warrior if you're expecting a lot of aggressive decks at your set championship, as she'll be able to help you spread even more damage. And Cinderella Stouthearted as a 1 or 2 of could be a great explosive game closer, and a good option if you're expecting a lot of steel decks. With singers and solid removal, Steel Song is good against any aggressive deck such as Amber Amethyst or Amethyst Emerald. It also has a great matchup into Ruby Amethyst thanks to aggressive questers and Pete. Ruby Sapphire though can be a huge problem, where Steel Song's low strength characters are susceptible to removal, and is by far one of the most difficult matches you'll play with this deck. Sapphire Steel is another tough matchup, especially if they have access to resist, which invalidates much of Steel's removal. Ruby Sapphire is perhaps Lorcana's best control deck. The combination of Sapphire's ink gaining abilities and Ruby's removal creates a deck with perhaps the strongest mid-game in Lorcana. Sapphire's search tools make the deck consistent and flexible, able to almost always find the answers needed. And the deck rewards patience and a more tactical approach to gameplay. But it's also a complicated deck to pilot, with so many decisions to make each turn, and its slow early game means it can struggle against aggressive and rogue decks. As a control deck, Ruby Sapphire uses its seemingly unlimited resources to grind down opponents before closing out the game. In the early game, Ruby Sapphire is looking to ink aggressively. Tipo will be a familiar card to Sapphire players, but it's still the Azurite Sea that provides more consistency. Being able to ink twice on turn 2 and then deploy an item is huge for the tempo of this deck. This becomes especially important as most lists are cutting Fishbone Quill. After that, setting up a Grandma Tala or Hiram Flavisham on board will provide extra card draw to refill your hand, and they can both sing How Far I'll Go for some extra ink. The biggest change to Ruby Sapphire this set is Maui Half Shark. Being able to recur actions as well as generate lore as actions are played gives the deck a powerful new win condition. We've included 2 copies of Vitalosphere in our list too, to allow Maui to rush in and gain immediate value from his ability. A Pirate's Life has also been added to the deck list to counteract some of the early aggression that could often be too much for this deck to handle. Outside of that, Tamator is still included as your other win condition. He can recur items to be banished by Hiram for card draw, and can offer huge lore gains in the late game with Lucky Dime. And especially against Sapphire decks with removal tools for items, be sure to only play your Lucky Dime when you can get value out of it. When it comes to removal, Sisu Daring Visitor continues to pair well with the Ice Block to remove early game threats, as well as Brawl. Similarly, Sisu Empowered Sibling and Ice Block can often wipe your opponent's side of the board. If you're able to shift in at 6 ink, this can often be too much for most decks to recover from. And if you need to find those answers, Visions of the Future is there to let you dig through your deck to find them, giving Ruby Sapphire the consistency it needs to play the long game. The core of Ruby Sapphire is very tight, however there is a bit of room for creativity depending on your local meta. If you're expecting a lot of aggressive decks, the Queen of Hearts is a good early game option, though it does weaken your matchup into other decks. Another anti-aggro option is Scar Vicious Cheater. Especially when paired with Ice Block, Scar can often survive far longer than he should and provide a pseudo one-sided board wipe. Finally, Raya Commander and Rider is another card worth considering. Since you'll be inking a lot with this deck, you'll really be able to make use of her ability. Being able to challenge twice with a character like Maui Halfshark will provide some absolutely insane value. Ruby Sapphire absolutely steamrolls most versions of Amber Steel decks. It also has a favourable matchup into Amethyst Steel. Ruby Sapphire does however struggle into more aggressive decks. Amber Amethyst can be a really one-sided matchup, as can both Amethyst Emerald and even Ruby Amethyst. If you're looking for a deck that's a little bit more straightforward, Amber Amethyst may be for you. The only hyper aggro deck on our list, it's a good pick if you're looking to just go fast with questing, whilst more or less ignoring what your opponent is doing on their side of the board. Amber Amethyst is also a deck that could be well suited to people less familiar with TCGs and younger players, as the strategy is often just turning things sideways and rushing to 20 low. It has potential to go under many of the slower control decks, and can even give mid-range decks a run for their money if the stars align. But being aggro, the deck can be incredibly fragile. But in smaller events, you'll likely be able to eke out enough points to snag a card. Amber Amethyst is a deck that wants to go as fast as possible, and so has a very low curve and a strong roster of low cost, high lore characters. Daisy Duck remains the MVP of this deck. Her 4 willpower makes her particularly difficult to deal with, while her ability can often get rid of potential removal from your opponent. You'll almost always want to play Daisy on turn 1, and then follow up with 2 more 1-drops on turn 2 to really apply pressure. If you're able to get 3 Daisies on board by turn 2, there's very little that can stop this deck. With Azurite Sea, Hyper Aggro got a new threat in Lilo, Escape Artist, another fine turn 2 play, and being able to replay Lilo turn after turn from the discard pile can whittle down your opponent's resources. Baloo remains a strong play on turn 3, providing 2 guaranteed lore in most matchups. Donald Duck provides some extra lore and protection on turn 3 as well. Chip, another new card from Azurite Sea, provides a similar effect, though he trades the bodyguard ability for 3 strength. Good Job is another action that provides the same effect, giving your characters even more lore to rush with. Of course, Genie makes an appearance in this list too, but as a 4-cost uninkable, we've limited the copies to focus more on the all-out aggression. Since the deck can be notoriously fragile, an interactive lore gain in the way of gathering knowledge and wisdom, Goat and White Rose will be there to help you close out the game. To provide some added utility, we've included Befuddle as a way to send back opponent threats. Played on a 2-cost character like Madam Mim Snake can be crippling for many Amethyst decks to deal with. An Amethyst Chromacon is included in our list too to provide card draw to find what you need to close the game. There's a lot of room for individual expression in Amber Amethyst, depending on your playstyle and expected meta. If you want a little more stability going into the mid game, Sven is a fine addition that can protect some of your characters from being removed in challenges, whilst himself questing for 2. Dolores Madrigal could be another option, adding more card draw for the deck. If you're worried about handing your opponent cards, the Chromacon could be replaced with friends on the other side, though this slows the tempo of the deck a little bit. Finally, the library is always an option in decks like this, providing another way to generate lore that your opponent must deal with. Amber Amethyst shines against control decks, and has a great matchup into Ruby Sapphire, and can oftentimes have decent matchups into decks such as Amethyst Sapphire. The low willpower characters though does mean this deck will struggle against most Steel decks, including Steel Song and Amethyst Steel, but it's a super fun deck that can really catch people off guard. And there you go, that's our 6 suggestions for decks to bring to the Azurite Sea Set Champs. Let us know in the comments which deck you'll be taking with you. Is it one from our list or something spicier? And if you found this video useful, be sure to hit the like button on your way out, and subscribe too, as we'll have gameplay videos featuring these 6 decks coming very soon. Until then, best of luck getting your hands on the Scar promo card, and of course, happy questing.